welcome from me, and on behalf of the Wittgenstein initiative. I'd like to say a few words about the initiative before introducing our theme for this evening. I'd like to remind you of why we are here. We're here to remind Vienna that there once upon a time was a man called Ludwig Wittgenstein who stood for a set of cultural values that were the obsession of his life, really and truly, and that somehow tend to get lost in the shuffle in the city of dreams. Let's try to make that a little bit more concrete. Wittgenstein's Vienna was the Vienna of Karl Kraus, of Adolf Loos, about whom we'll be hearing a lot tonight, of Otto Weininger, who people avoid like the plague, sometimes for good reasons, sometimes not for reasons that aren't so good. Let's just think about Karl Kraus for a second. He's more important than ever. Why? Because there's something called fake news out in the world, and it was Karl Kraus who probably was the first person to call people's attention to fake news. Strangely enough, I haven't heard anybody talking about Karl Kraus in this connection. And by the way, if we're going to get around to school reform, there's one point that could very well be brought into the discussion. Okay, having said all that, I'm very, very happy to welcome Christopher Long, Professor of Architectural History at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was once in my life. I gave away a bride in Austin. Never got her back. Anyway, be that as it may, Adolf Loos and Wittgenstein, a very interesting couple. Wittgenstein once said, "You or me." We don't really know why, and until a couple of hours ago, talking to Christopher Long, I didn't know much about the background to that myself, or what could be a background. So we'll be hearing some things about how these two people fit together in the context of architecture, in the context of this house, this wonderful house that we're sitting in at this moment. So rather than take up more of your time, I'll just pass the word on to Christopher Long. Very welcome. Thank you very much, Christopher.
So good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming, and I'm sorry for the delay. We had a little technical snafu. Oh, it's a bit loud. Is that better? Can you all hear me in the back well? Fine. I have to say a couple of things first. I'd like to thank very much the Bulgarian Cultural Institute for hosting us here tonight. And I'd particularly like to thank the Wittgenstein Initiative and Radmila Schweitzer for having us here. It's quite a lovely thing, and it's a nice opportunity for me to speak to you. I have to say that when I received the invitation to make this talk, and that was back in December, I thought, oh yeah, sure, easy. Wittgenstein, Loos, yeah, sure, I'll come give a lecture, why not? And then it started to occur to me that I actually had to say something intelligent. That became more difficult, but then it finally dawned on me in about February that I had to say something original. And that was much more difficult. For I realized very quickly, as I thought about the issue, that saying anything original on this topic was going to be very, very hard. For as many of you know, those of you who are familiar with Wittgenstein, those of you who are familiar with this house, you will know that there's a considerable literature on this house from some very good architectural historians, Bernhard Leitner, Paul Weiderfeld, August Sarnitz, also Otto Kapfenger, who've all treated the house in some detail and have talked about its features, looked at its history in great detail. There's also a very good literature on Wittgenstein as an architect. There's a considerable literature now on Paul Engelmann, who was Wittgenstein's assistant for the house. So what do I have to say? Well, in part, I'm going to agree with what my predecessors have said. That's not very interesting. That's not the original part. But I hope as we go along, I will try to say something I hope that is original. In order to get to that point, I've divided my talk into 3 parts. The first part has to do with form. For the very interesting thing is that one can talk about a comparison between Loos and Wittgenstein in formal terms. And that begins simply by looking at the object in which we are now seated or standing in my case. That object, of course, quite extraordinary, and at first glance, one would suppose perhaps it's somehow Loosian. It's a box, after all, a cube, or at least a cube with parts. The fenestration's a little odd. That, at least to the untrained eye, can look Loosian. But if we looked a little closer and we see actually these really fine images I just had made by Wolfgang Thaler of the house, you can see something very interesting, which is that the fenestration is in fact rather regular. The proportions are, in fact, if you have an eye for them, if you spend as much time as I do in an architecture school where you're looking at proportions constantly, my eye tells me that those proportions are regular and, more to the point, classical. In fact, exactly classical. And as one enters into this space, just as you all did this evening, the striking feature of the house is its purism. It's clean, it's simple, it's direct. It is remarkably, as one would say in German, schlicht, really extraordinarily so. And indeed, as one moves through the house in rather interesting ways, other things come out. One thing that's immediately apparent is how much light there is in the building. In fact, as one comes into the entrance, one of the very striking features is, in fact, that there's light right at the entrance. It's a quite bright and light entrance. And I highlight that because I'll come back to in a moment why I think that's important in some sense. If one looks at the plan is also interesting, but not particularly modern. In fact, if one looks at this with a modernist eye, one's struck by the fact that, in fact, in many senses, this is a 19th century or maybe even an 18th century building in its layout. What makes it maybe not an 18th century building is, in fact, that it doesn't connect, the rooms don't connect exactly en filade in a row. But there's something strangely not modern about this interior, if one thinks about it. This is also true about the way in which the fenestration works along the sides. It's regular, these continuous interlocking French doors. It's also notable, again, the degree to which there's evenness, repetition, lightness, and even surprisingly, a certain kind of continuity, a continuity that happens on mostly, in fact, almost exclusively, a horizontal plane. Because if one looks at a section of the house, one of the first things that would be interesting to me and my students is how, in fact, I'm standing in the way, how very regular it in fact is. It is remarkably, in that sense, irregular and not very interesting, frankly, modernist design from that period. By contrast, if we look at a contemporary work from Loos, this, of course, is the Villa Mola, now the home of the Israeli ambassador in Vienna. This is one of the original photographs from Martin Gerlach, by the way, lovely photograph. Front and rear. 2 already immediate things should jump out at you, even if you're not well versed in architecture, and that is that the fenestration is very, very different. The windows are placed in a quite different way. It's also notable that when one enters the house through a rather unobtrusive door, not the kind of grand entrance that one sees here, that the space is in fact not lit in the same way. It's a relatively small window. It is typically for Loos cramped. And very interestingly, if you manage to get in the house, it's rather difficult. You need all kinds of permissions from the Israelis and the Mossad to get inside, but I've been in. It's quite interesting. And when you walk in, the very first thing you do, you turn right. You walk in a very tiny little chamber, and you're forced to turn right and go up the stairs that you see here that seem to go, well, nowhere. Because in fact, what happens in the house is that one goes through a series of very quick meanders that lead into a passageway here, really an extraordinary one. So that's the door coming up, and then one's forced to go all the way 180 degrees around and then back up the stairs again to the right, and then finally to come up into the living area. And amazingly, the space was so complex that Loos, who otherwise almost never drew sections or axonometrics, produced one in this case to actually work out how the stairs would be and how the space would be. And you can see in the projection, very nice projection, lovely drawing. In this case by Mr. Kulka, who was his assistant. You can see, in fact, the relative complexity. That staircase, I would submit to you, is deeply, deeply different from the one that you just entered. And in fact, the section is also different. Because the section, of course, as we see, is broken up in levels. We're looking at a beautiful example, one of the very early and perfect examples of Loos's idea of the Raumplan, of space planning. But the problems don't, or the differences don't end there, because as one comes into the main space, once again, the levels are broken up. There's a lower seating area, an upper seating area. There's a staircase off to one side, which is essentially from here off to the side towards the piano, essentially, is a dining room and music space. You can see it here. This is actually slightly altered. Originally, there wasn't a staircase linking the rooms, or at least not a broad staircase as one sees it now. Notice also that the wall treatment is very, very different from this room, for it is in fact covered with rather beautiful and quite expensive wood, not the simple kind of plastered surface that we see here. And very interestingly, the rooms open and close, but they open and close in such a way as to allow one to have all kinds of different spatial perceptions. In fact, to pull those doors shut is to create a whole series of different kinds of spatial experiences, which is to say this: in formal terms, to argue that the house Wittgenstein and any of Loos's better villas of the 1920s have any real similarities is in fact pretty silly. They're in fact markedly different. You almost have to be blind or not know anything about architecture to argue that in fact there's an overlap here. So here's the first problem, and I'm not the only one to point this out. Believe me, everyone who's looked at this has said, oh, well, this house, the Wittgenstein house, isn't Loosian at all. It's obvious. So in formal terms, there is no interconnection between the two. This is not a Loosian house, although Paul Engelmann, who was a student of Loos, had worked with Wittgenstein in the end. This is very much a distinctive Wittgensteinian product and not a Loosian one. So we come to the second issue, the issue of experience. How does one experience the spaces? What is the nature of the spaces? And here again, the differences are remarkably telling. For once more, what's striking is the relative formality of this house. It is, as Weidefeld and others have argued, a palais. It is very much based on older palace types. It's very much a formal entry. It's very much bilaterally symmetrical as one comes in. That's all quite deliberate. There's a marked emphasis on technology, quite beautifully so, for example, in the openings for the windows. There's also a marked emphasis on regularity. For example, if you notice and spend some time walking around the house, you can see in the way that the stones are laid, they're also quite precisely placed. In fact, almost placed at the point of obsession. And as one comes up even more so, there's nearly a fetish of metal here and glass, as if, well, the house was built by an engineer, which it was, an engineer and philosopher. But of course, the very interesting thing about this house is the way in which Margarete Wittgenstein and then others after her and the family lived here. They lived here not in a particularly, we could say, modern way. The house was furnished rather eclectically. Some of it Baroque, some of it neo-Baroque, some pieces modern. This is some sketches many of you probably know of the house as it was. You can imagine these spaces with these furnishings. And there we see them again, quite strikingly, not very modern. And indeed, even later after the war, the interior spaces were, I keep standing in the way, I'm very sorry, even after the war, quite not what one would expect for this kind of design. And yet the same thing is true for Loos. This is, of course, not the Moller-Haus, but the Müller-Haus, the one in Prague. The very interesting thing about the Müller-Haus, the very interesting thing about Loos interiors is the degree to which they are, in fact, shockingly conservative. Really remarkably so. Though I would submit to you that they share one common affinity, and that is you have a modernist frame, rather purely, and the furniture sits separately from it. In other words, the interior furnishings are divorced from the architectonic frame. That's how we would say that in an architecture school. If you look at the original spaces, now we're back in the house Moller here in Vienna. If you look at the original spaces, becomes even more clear, where when the furniture is removed, as it was when this photograph was made by Martin Gerlach, you have a very, very different feeling of that space. And indeed, looking back down from the dining room back into the music room, in this case where only the piano survives, there are a few built-ins, but otherwise the sensibility here is similar, but ultimately also different. Because in experiential terms, Loos, of course, provides a very different way of moving through the space and experiencing the space. One comes in, one's forced into immediate engagement. The path plan, which you see here in red, shows, in fact, how rapidly one is forced to move and turn, how quickly one's sense of direction is altered. If one strolls through this house in its sort of grandiosity, in Loos's house, you're forced into a whole series of very abrupt movements that changes one's perceptions rather rapidly. And notable also in Loos's houses, particularly of this period of the 1920s and early 1930s, is the degree to which many of the seating spaces are built in. By building in those seating spaces, you create a sense of warmth, frankly, Gemütlichkeit, a sense of casualness, but also relaxed living that is, in fact, markedly different, again, from the room that we're all in at the moment. So I come to the third part of my talk. And by the way, everything I've said up to now, other people have said. In fact, there are whole books about this. So I have said absolutely nothing new up to this point, except that my pictures were a little better than theirs. That's it. Now here's the interesting part. Formally, and for the most part in terms of experience, Loos as an architect and Wittgenstein as an architect have very little to do with each other. There's really not much basis for comparison. What I would submit to you, however, is this. The buildings may be different, but the architects, in a strange and interesting way, operated in the same fashion. By which I mean this. They shared certain ways of thinking, certain kinds of intellectual assumptions, certain ways of going about dealing with the problem of making space, making a building. This is where the argument becomes, well, interesting, I think, at least I hope. And I want to tell you a bit of a story. It's a little bit of a longish story, so bear with me. It has to do with some work I've been doing lately. And it involves what happens early on in Loos's career. So you have this famous quote from Karl Kraus, where he says, you know, that what we have in common is that we're able to separate out what a Nachttopf is from a vase, right? So one thing and the other. He grammatically, literally, and so forth, the chamber pot and the urn. Right? All of you know the quote. I forgot to put it in there in German, but hopefully all of you know it. It's about this idea that one can separate out what one thing means from the next thing. The question I asked about Loos is, where did the idea come from? In other words, how did Loos come to this point? And this is something I set out to explore in a way that had to do with Loos's trip to America. For I spent a good part of the last 2 years digging around, trying to understand what had been written about Loos's journey to America and what, well, really happened, I think. The problem, of course, is, as is so often the case with historical moments, the sources are not very broad nor deep, so to speak. But I discovered some interesting things. I actually found the ship he went on. This is it. The Wieland he went on. Not much of a ship. In fact, about the cheapest passage one could buy. And he went in steerage in a cabin living with 8 other people. Or actually 7 other people. It was set up for 8. He arrived in New York. He spent a short time in New York. We know it was about a week only. And then he went to Philadelphia, where his uncle lived. So the brother of his father. He was a watchmaker, a craftsperson, and that for Loos was a very important thing. After roughly a month or so in Philadelphia, Loos made his way to Chicago. And here becomes the very interesting myths about Loos, because if you read the literature about Loos's early life and how he comes to his ideas, it's all about Chicago, 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 Chicago. But I dug into this a bit, and I did some calculations, and I found out he actually spent 1 week in Chicago. Did he see this famous building? This is the Home Insurance Company building from William LeBaron Jenny. Very important building in the history of architecture, for it was long believed that this was the first full-frame building in the history of architecture. Turns out when they demolished it, it wasn't really a full-frame building. It was only partially. There's a good thing about America is they eventually tear everything down so you can find out these things. Did he see, for example, the Wainwright building in St. Louis? In those days, if you would have gone by train to Chicago, you almost certainly would have gone through St. Louis. You could have gotten off. The building was very new. It's very likely that a young architecture student, for that's what he was at that time, would have gone off the train and gone to see the most exciting new building in St. Louis. Did he see it? We don't know. He didn't write anything about that. In fact, the very interesting thing about Loos is the only thing he writes about is his experience at the World's Columbian Exposition. And he doesn't write very much, and he doesn't write it at the time. He only writes it later. And what he says is quite striking. He doesn't mention the buildings, which, as you can see, were all actually Beaux-Arts Revival. They were all neoclassical, with one exception, one notable exception, the building by Louis Sullivan. What he talks about instead is this: the display of German arts and crafts, Kunstgewerbe. And he said he went there thinking he was going to be so proud of what the Germans showed in America, because the Americans knew nothing about art or design. And the experience he found, in fact, well, shattering. Because nothing he saw particularly paid out what he expected. In fact, he came away with a very deep sense of disappointment. He didn't quite know what it all meant. Later he would write this, and I'll read you actually what it says in German. Schreibt, die scharfe amerikanische und englische Luft hat alle Eingenommenheit gegen die Erzeugnisse meiner eigenen Zeit von mir mitgenommen. What happens to Loos in Chicago is he comes to the realization, the very important realization, that what he assumed to be good design before was not. But the very interesting thing is that he didn't know what the answer was. The answer only came to him, reportedly, in New York, where he spent the next 2.5 years. The remarkable thing, again, about the literature on Loos is it all talks about Chicago and his American experience, but he was there for 1 week, and he was 2.5 years in New York. Right? Remarkable thing. The most interesting thing about his experience in New York comes from a text. It was in New York where a suitcase in a store attracted his attention. This is from Robert Schoy. A leather case wrapped with copper banding. The next morning, he had a realization that the suitcase he had seen the day before, was the modern style. From that moment on, he began to break with it all. Everything that was false, wrongly conceived, he decried. His motto became, that which is practical is beautiful. This is a story that Loos related to Schoy much later. But the key thing here is not the suitcase, which is what people have focused on, not the craftsmanship of the suitcase, but something very significant for Loos, and it's this. Starting in this period, it must have been 1896 or 1895, Loos began to work out a way to make evaluations. And he did so through a rather interesting process. The process was he would look at any object and began to ask fundamental questions about it. Is it well made? Is it practical? Is it beautiful? Is it modern? All of these questions were essentially binary. They had a yes or a no answer. Is it practical? Yes or no. Is it beautiful? Yes or no. Is it modern? Yes or no. And what he would do over the course of time, and I can't show you today because it's going to be too frustrating with the text, what he does over the course of the next 10 years, really until the time he publishes Ornament and, well, he gives Ornament Crime as a lecture in 1909 and 1910, is to work out a very sophisticated way of answering these questions. What is modern? What is not modern? What is appropriate? What's inappropriate? What's new? What's not new? When should we copy? When should we not copy? When should we use articles from the past? When should we not use them from the past? The process he goes through intellectually is a process that I describe as sorting. He sorts through things. He simply looks and thinks about problems in design, and he sets them up in binary opposition, yes or no, and then creates in his mind, apparently, a kind of matrix, a way of describing each problem that he confronted. With each question, there would be an answer, a yes or a no. And it's very interesting. If you read his text very carefully over that period of time, roughly from the time he returns to Vienna, when he starts writing in 1897, until the time of Ornament and Crime in 1910, and even actually after that, what's so interesting about Loos is that he considers each design problem in this rather interestingly binary way. Yes or no? Is something appropriate or inappropriate? Is it culturally right or culturally wrong? Is it beautiful or is it not beautiful? It's some years, actually, after Loos starts writing that he begins designing. And it's when he begins designing that he starts to apply these ideas. How he makes design decisions is actually, in some sense, very simple. He decides on any design decision based on these binary opposites. He says, is this appropriate for my space? Yes or no. Can I use this piece of furniture? Yes or no. Can I do this in a room? Yes or no. And the question always has to do for him with two things fundamentally, but mostly it has to do with, well, cultural appropriateness. Is it culturally appropriate? Is it ultimately modern? Does it fit the times? Does it fit our culture? And so forth. Young architects from that period, by the way, would have been primed to ask questions this way. Loos isn't the only one who does it. They get this from something that they get in university, and that is a reading of Vitruvius. Because the very interesting thing about Vitruvius is that a good bit of the early part of Vitruvius is about the problem of decorum. Which kind of temple is correct? What is correct in architecture? What is incorrect fundamentally? In classical terms, that's a rather interesting set of problems. It drives a lot of architectural discourse in the 18th and early 19th centuries. But for Loos, it's a way of thinking that allows him to make decisions about the modern. So here's my argument. In the end, what Loos shares with Wittgenstein is not anything formal. It's not really in terms of how they design their houses experientially. It's how they think about architecture, and more to the point, how they make decisions. For the very interesting thing about Wittgenstein is that he makes decisions in very much the same way. In fact, strikingly in the same way. He very often asks questions of appropriateness. He very carefully sorts one thing from the next thing. In each case, inquiring as to whether it's the right thing or the wrong thing, whether it has this meaning or that meaning. In other words, he sets up very much as Loos a set of binary oppositions. And indeed, if one reads Wittgenstein very carefully, a good bit of the texts are involved exactly with these questions of appropriateness and so forth. I'm not an expert on Wittgenstein, but we have one here. very nicely and very conveniently. It works much better than the projector does, as it turns out. And so I'm going to ask Professor Janik to talk about Wittgenstein in this context, and then we'll have a conversation, I hope, about whether this really holds up, whether this idea of sorting is what really, in fact, makes Wittgenstein and Loos an interesting pairing. In fact, that they're not in any sense formally kindred as designers or thinkers, that they have very little to do with each other about ideas of living, but that they think in very similar ways. Good?
Thank you. Is this working?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Christopher, very much. Of course, one can immediately multiply a number of very, very dramatic examples of how Wittgenstein thought and about how it is that taste, to use his word, this Geschmack, is a long, long discussion which is fairly easy to work out if you want to in the vermischte Bemerkung, culture and value, about taste. And taste is absolutely crucial when he's thinking about culture, when he's thinking about architecture and philosophy, because this comes up again and again. In architecture, it's like it is in philosophy, and so that's, I mean, if what you say is right, as I believe it is, this is going to be, has to be fundamental. So let's take some examples from Wittgenstein's life. One of my absolute favorite ones is an anecdote that Wittgenstein's dear friend Rudolf Koder, who was the music teacher at the school where Wittgenstein was teaching in Niederösterreich, once told me. He said, you know, when Wittgenstein came to visit, which is fairly often, he said, we would take all the pictures off the walls because as soon as he arrived, he would begin to tell us we needed to rearrange them. And so we spent, instead of spending the evening as we had otherwise planned, we would spend the whole evening rearranging the order of the pictures in the house. And Koder, of course, adored Wittgenstein. He added, and he was always right, which was a little bit, a little bit too much of the fine. But one finds again and again and again, when one of his students goes to war in 1940, Ludwig presents him with a silver cup because he's not in for a party, but water tastes best from silver, drink it out of silver. So you find there in small anecdotes, but also in bigger and more important matters. As we were talking earlier, I mean, there are many, and I've been working on Wittgenstein for well over 50 years now, and there are as many problems today as there were then. One very fascinating one is that his Tractatus had to be published just the way it was published. Now, the two people whose opinions he most respected, Gottlob Frege, the great father of modern logic, and Ludwig von Vicker, the editor of the Brenner, they both said, you know, certainly you should publish this. It's very, very important, but you have to publish it in a different form. And Wittgenstein laughed. That's out of the question. It's out of the question. Nothing can be changed. And what one sees in the Tractatus is, and I mean, I'm sure there are any number of people sitting in front of me who are in the same position we are here. You look into that book and you just wonder, what is this all about, really and truly? Because there are any number of gnomic almost impossible passages there, which for him had to be there, that's all. No ands, ifs, buts, or maybes. This work must be the way it is, because it is appropriate. And the whole category of what is appropriate is something you find almost at every turn in Wittgenstein's life. There's the famous story about building the house and wanting to lower the ceiling a couple of centimeters, which people, many people think is rather strange, but it's completely typical for Wittgenstein. When one knows his personality, when one understands what is sometimes called his mindset, it would be peculiar if there were no such stories, if he didn't want to change things. Rudolf Coder, once again, and he came back, was a wonderful source to me many years ago when I first came to Vienna for precisely matters of this point. He said, Wittgenstein was hell for any tailor to work with, because the button had to be just here and not just there. By the time that Wittgenstein was through with him, the tailor needed a long nap. Once again, it's very well known that at a certain point, Wittgenstein, who had been originally a bit of a dandy, that he gave that way of life up. And he no longer wore a tie. Well, there's one of the people who was around in those days said, well, if you knew the painstakingness, with which he had chosen this tie that he had now decided not to wear, that's what makes the story really so impressive. So there's almost nowhere you can look in his work. Once again, for us, last time we were here together, we were talking about Wittgenstein's corpus. Wittgenstein's corpus is a disaster for scholarship, for scholars, because he refused to publish anything. Well, very little was right, in the sense that that Professor Long has been calling our attention to. And if it wasn't right, it just couldn't. He wanted to see this stuff published. But for that reason, he appointed his literary executors to choose what was fit to publish. But he couldn't do it himself because these criteria, which you've so nicely laid out, in the case of Loos, were not fulfilled. So, with that, I'll give you the ball back.
Now, oh, there we go. Before we came here today, I had actually coffee with Professor Janik, and we talked about this at some length, about what we would actually say. And he asked me, in fact, what I would talk about, and I started to give a little spiel of what I thought all of this meant. And he stopped me after about 5 sentences, and he said, do you realize how many times you've said appropriate or appropriateness? I thought, well, yes, probably in every sentence twice. But he was correct, because, in fact, this is really the key concept for Loos and for Wittgenstein. It's what's fitting. It's what belongs. It's the way it should be that combines or brings them together as thinkers. This idea of appropriateness runs through all of their thinking over and over and over again, to the point where when Wittgenstein finally decided that Loos was being inappropriate, he jettisoned him as a friend. there's a kind of underlying grammar to this sort of thinking, and that's the very interesting thing. In modern thinking, there are various ways of going about solving a problem. And typically nowadays, we don't solve problems in this way. We don't solve them through asking the question of appropriateness. We ask them mostly in modernism through the question of functionality. Does something function? Or more commonly, in commercial capitalism, does it make money? But for Loos and Wittgenstein, fundamentally, the cultural question stood at the forefront. And I want to underscore that because, in fact, this building that we're in is foremost, more than maybe anything else, a cultural artifact in that sense. It's an expression of a cultural worldview, not an expression of a way of living, but an expression of a cultural worldview. Wittgenstein's very distinctive and in some ways quirky and odd way of thinking about the world. And one could say very much the same about Loos. In that sense, then, I think we have come to a different place in thinking about these two thinkers. For what's quite extraordinary is the degree to which, in fact, they shared certain commonalities that go to the basis of how they solve problems, a kind of grammar of problem solving or a grammar of thinking, which I find, in fact, really compelling. It would be worth exploring those commonalities more. Maybe in my next life I'll write this book. I don't know that I'm going to do it anytime soon, but it certainly could be done. It certainly could be constructed in a really interesting way of parallels. Maybe you can write that book. Somebody younger out here in the audience can write that book. But it's doable. It's quite doable, and in the end, it's more revelatory. It will show us far more than any kind of superficial comparisons will. Do you have anything else you want to say?
No. Yes. Since my dear friend Gregor Schmoll is here, who will be making an exhibition of Wittgenstein's photography. 2018, in the Leopold Museum. Wittgenstein's attitude towards photography is something that is not so well known, but fits this to a T. One of his favorite games, Wittgenstein had a sense of playing. He liked to play games occasionally, but very, very strange ones, and ones that he would invent himself. And one of them was to go to Woolworths. Woolworths, that was once upon a time a very, very cheap department store, 5 and 10 cent stores we used to call it. And he would buy he would go with his friends, and they would all buy the cheapest camera that they could get, and go out and take pictures. Now, Wittgenstein then, when these pictures were developed, he would sit for hours with a razor blade, paring away, so millimeters, until the picture that was left was just right. You know, just not so, but like that. And as my last example, I'll take the example of his visit to Norman Malcolm, his American student, when Wittgenstein was in America, for the only time in his life. I was myself at that time 8 years old. We could have met because he came to a place that I used to go to in western Massachusetts, where I grew up. Pity we didn't, but that's his life. But Malcolm's toilet broke. And he fixed the toilet. It ran again. And then he began to make further adjustments. And Wittgenstein said, "Leave the bloody thing alone." Because once again, you're transgressing a certain kind of limit that has to do with what's appropriate to the situation. So on that note.
So, und also Fragen oder sowas, das können wir auch genauso gut auf Deutsch machen, wenn ihr wollt. Ja? Ja, bitte sehr.
I'm somewhat puzzled by two things, and I would just ask your comments. One is, obviously, when this piece of land was bought, he must have had an influence on not just the house itself, but everything around it.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if you look at the house today, one of the things which strikes me about the difference between the way it is now and the way it was when it was built is the entrance.
Mm-hmm.
Not the inside entrance, but the outside entrance.
Yeah.
And I would ask your comment about that. The other thing that strikes me is that he built this house for someone.
For his sister.
And I think that it shows. And I am a little bit surprised that that side of the influence on him, you didn't mention it, but maybe it's just because of the time. But could you comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on both of those. So why the entrance was different, we don't know, because Wittgenstein made many decisions about how the house would be sited, how one would enter, and so forth, and he wrote nothing about this. So unfortunately, it's hard to comment on something when we have no real information. He must have considered it very carefully because he considered everything very carefully about the house, but I don't know the answer to why the entrance was where it was and why it was changed. Well, I know why it was changed. I don't know why the entrance was originally where it was, so I don't know the answer to that. Yeah, do you know? From his standpoint.
I only know what I know from the family, and I've never met him, so it's secondhand. But the entrance from the Grundmanngasse, I would say two things. The entrance from the Grundmanngasse was, of course, it was a grand and practical entrance, because if you were driving and his sister was always driving, you entered and arrived right at the front door, and it was quite grand because it was a sort of a ramp, and on one side there was a garden, and that's the other point. You talked about the light, but you didn't talk about the view, and the view at that time was very important because it isn't the way it is now.
Correct.
But the garden was very important because from wherever you were at that side of the house, what you saw was a green, lush garden.
Yeah, yeah.
Just those two comments.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct in both cases. There were a lot of things I didn't talk about because I did this somewhat in shorthand, and particularly with the technological issues, it became rather difficult tonight. Question?
Yeah. I'm fine about that. First of all, thank you. It was really, really interesting to hear your perspective in comparison between the two. The thing that I would like to ask is, so what I understood is you're saying, the experience of being in the two buildings is very different, and the sort of spatial logic is very different, and also in terms of its relationship to history, but what they have in common is the binary decision, or the way that decisions are made in a binary way. So
Perfect, yeah. That's exactly what I said.
okay, perfect. Just to make sure I got it right. But my question then is, if you think that binary way of making a decision is something that was new and that they in a way invented at the time, or that's something that then sort of defined modernism, or became that, it's basically, because you're saying the design process is really the decisive point. Because I actually think that in a way it could be compared to the digital design, because in the end things have to be binary. And you know, you could also say that the moment you're building something, you have to make a binary decision again, like, because you have to define it with some kind of physical coordinate. So I'm just wondering if that binary decision that you're defining between the two, where that stands in the history of design processes for you.
It's a wonderful question. You made a perfect summary, so you get a 1 on your grade. No, we all make binary decisions all the time. It's, as human beings, we constantly do this. I wake up, am I hungry, am I not hungry? Right? Yeah, well, it is a decision. Yeah, well, okay. Whether I eat or not. Okay, fine. Well, I solved the problem of hunger, right? So, but we make binary decisions constantly as human beings. What I'm arguing about Loos and Wittgenstein is that they take this way of thinking, which we all do as human beings, and they take it to an extreme. In other words, they make this a way of making decisions about almost everything. Is it related to contemporary digital art? Yes, absolutely, because so much of what happens in digital art is binary by nature. Is it ingrained deeply in modernism? I would argue probably no. I would argue that most of the modernists didn't make decisions this way. So if we look, for example, at someone like Mies as an architect, it's not the way he operated. It's not the way he thought about how to make space or how to create solutions in architecture. He thought in much more conventional ways as an architect. The last thing I would say is what's so interesting about Loos and Wittgenstein in their use of this kind of thinking is the extent to which for them it was always driven by cultural assumptions. It was always based on culture. So yeah, but I think essentially what you're saying is correct. Yeah, please.
I think as we're talking, the more and more examples turn up from the Wittgenstein side, and one of the really interesting and profound places where Wittgenstein gets involved directly almost in the kind of thing that you're talking about is when he's talking about color. Now, through his whole lifetime, Wittgenstein comes back again and again and again to talk about colors and things. Reflecting on colors has enormous philosophical significance. But I think here, one of his exercises is to say, well, how far can you go? How much of this binary thinking, as you call it, is forced upon us by the nature of the object that we're talking about. So he will talk about, for example, we say brown, but we don't say reddish green. Why don't we do that? And it's, the first time you come across a question like that as a philosophy student, you think one of us is crazy, and it's probably not me. It's very, very difficult. But I mean, this was one of Wittgenstein's tropes in philosophy. He comes back to again and again. So how far can you go? How far can you go?
Ja, ich möchte nur sagen, zum Verhältnis Wittgenstein-Loos müsste man da nicht unterscheiden zwischen der Architektur von Loos und der Ästhetik von Loos. Wittgenstein war sehr, sehr von Loos beeinflusst, aber wie Sie natürlich sehr gut nachgewiesen haben, hat das Wittgenstein-Haus keineswegs etwas mit einer Loosschen Raumlösung zu tun, aber sehr viel mit der Loosschen Ästhetik. Und ich glaube, das lässt sich auch sehr gut herauslesen aus den Briefen und Tagebüchern der Margaret Stoneborough, die ja die Bauherrin war, die eigentlich ein sehr schwieriges Verhältnis zu Loos hatte. Sie war sehr skeptisch und unter Einfluss von Loos, von Wittgenstein, wendet sie sich dann zunehmend Loos zu und einmal erwähnt sie, edles Material und Funktion, ist das schon Kunst? Also da sieht man, wie sehr sie sich damit unter Einfluss des Bruders auseinandergesetzt hat. Und ich glaube eben, gerade hier bei dem Haus wurde ja wirklich die teuersten Materialien eingesetzt und das Ganze sehr schlicht, dass das eben nicht ein Loos'scher Raumplan war, deswegen hat ja auch der Paul Engelmann das Handtuch geworfen, weil der kam ja aus der Loos-Schule, es ist klar, sie hatte ganz andere Vorstellungen, aber dass es doch sehr stark von der Ästhetik von Loos beeinflusst war. Und das lässt sich dann noch eigentlich weiterverfolgen. Es war ja dann 1929 Wittgenstein war dann schon in Cambridge und es war angedacht, dass er Möbel für das Haus entwerfen sollte. Und da gibt es eine grobe Skizze, ein ganz einfacher Sessel. Und sie schreibt, ja, das ist der Sessel aller Sessel. Und das hat mich so erinnert an einen Aufsatz von Loos, wo er schreibt, für einen Sessel, da braucht es ja keinen Architekten, den kann doch jeder gute Tischler machen. Und genau in dieser Richtung also denken Ludwig Wittgenstein und seine Schwester. Also da wird schon sehr, sehr deutlich, also wie stark der Einfluss von Loos war. Ja.
I would just say exactly right, except I would ask a question. If you have the same aesthetic assumptions, do they land on the same chair? And I would also say if they had the same aesthetic assumptions, which is correct, I believe, you're right about this, but they wouldn't pick the same stone. It's impossible for me to imagine that Loos would have picked this stone. So in other words, the process of thinking, again, is the same. The end effect is different. Fair enough? Yeah. So it wouldn't be the same chair in the end, right? There's a perfect chair out there, but it's not the same chair. Yeah. Question?
I should mention that I know much more about Wittgenstein and Loos, but when you talk, it was very interesting what you said. When you talk about appropriateness, I think that it's also worth mentioning that the early Wittgenstein had much more of a binary understanding.
Yes, that's correct.
It's either true or false. It's either
Right.
does have meaning or it doesn't.
Yes.
It's synless or not.
Exactly.
But then
And that changes.
It changes, and
Yes.
appropriate is, as we've heard before, appropriate to a situation. It's much more molding something into a pre-given background that has already certain shape. So you
Yes.
have to. It expresses much more what Wittgenstein does in his later philosophy, I think.
I think absolutely correct what you say. What I would say is in the 1920s, what becomes an added layer after this early sort of yes or no is it becomes, as was Loos, a question both of cultural meaning and aesthetic meaning, right? So he's working through that at this period when he's making the house. And later on, then he goes to another place where he starts to think about appropriateness in quite a different way. But you're quite right that his ideas develop over time in rather interesting and different ways. Yeah.
Maybe it's just an addition to this question. But I find it very, very remarkable that this house was built exactly in the time between the early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein. So it's a kind also of linking these two philosophies.
Yeah.
And I think exactly what you said, the binary decision, what you mentioned, is very typical for the early Wittgenstein, but the late Wittgenstein, it's, I think, very untypical.
I agree.
There's this famous remark where he says, I think it's very early, maybe 1929 or 30 after the beginning in Cambridge, he says, my method in philosophy is the transition from the question of truth to the question of sense.
Yes.
So der Übergang von der Frage nach der Wahrheit
Yeah.
zur Frage nach
Yeah.
dem Sinn. So there is not anymore this question, false or true,
Correct.
but he's asking other questions.
Yeah. But one way of understanding this house is that it's a linchpin between those two periods. Because the way he's asking questions here is not simply, does the door here go here or does the door not go here? The question becomes, is it appropriate to put the door here? And does that have cultural and other meaning? So in one sense, I agree. There's a difference between the early Wittgenstein and late Wittgenstein. The interesting thing is the house is exactly in the middle of those two things. And in one sense, one could make the argument that I'm not enough of a Wittgenstein expert to do it, but I think one could make the argument that the house becomes one of the ways of working this out, of becoming much more sophisticated about how decisions are made. In other words, it forced him, because there was a material substance to the decision-making, to begin to confront this problem of moving away from pure and simple binary oppositions to much more complex kinds of thinking. It would be an interesting piece to write, right? I think it would be possible to do that in a rather interesting way. Any other questions? Yes? There's a gentleman in the back.
Had you find a connection about the issue ornament and crime with Wittgenstein thinking?
The short answer is no. we don't even know if Wittgenstein ever confronted the piece directly or whether he heard the talk. So the very interesting thing about Ornament and Crime is that it was not published in German until the late 1920s. It was available in French in 1913, but before that, Loos only gave it as a talk. And to my knowledge, unless you know differently, or anyone in the audience knows differently, there's no evidence that Wittgenstein heard the lectures. He gave the lectures several times. Do you know this?
Ja, Margaret nimmt Bezug auf Ornament und Verbrechen während der Zeit des Baus.
Margaret did, but she did. But did he?
Und sicherlich über ihren Bruder. Sie hat es gekannt.
Okay, she knew
Es gibt
it.
eine explizite Stelle. Ja.
She knew it. I'm not sure when if he heard it or
Sie
not.
müssen es gekannt haben. Ja.
English, please.
English, please, yeah. So the question was, Frau Dr. Prokop said that Margarete, who of course lived here in the house, cited Ornament and Crime and knew it as the house was being constructed, and she assumes that it's because her brother had attended the lecture. I don't know. It's possible she attended the lecture. I don't know. Or she knew it from someone else. The problem is we don't have any direct evidence about him, only about her. Well, yeah, I mean, this is the problem. Yep.
I mean, from his youth, Ludwig had been used to being told things by his sister, you know, so it wouldn't be at all strange that he found out about this from her, you know. I mean, one just doesn't know, but both are possible. One knows that, I mean, most of his early reading was probably given to him by his sister, and perhaps also by his brothers, but one knows nothing about that period. I mean, I remain astonished at how little we know about so many of these things, including Wittgenstein's relationship to Adolf Loos. I mean, I wrote about that in Wittgenstein's Vienna in 1971 when that book was written. When I came down to write Assembling Reminders, my swan song with respect to Wittgenstein, I realized we didn't really know any more. We had a whole lot more texts and things and references, but in terms of substance, I was where I was 40 years earlier.
Very short of facts.
More an observation, really. I was just struck again by the photographs of the interior of the house as it was furnished, something I spent a lot of time looking at over the years. But again, struck here by how that sets up, in a sense, a kind of binary situation, too, of the outside and the inside and the questions they ask of each other. And it also struck me that another house that maybe works in a similar way is one that you'd be familiar with from Texas, is the de Menil house in Houston.
Yeah, very much.
Where also you have this, you have the Philip Johnson exterior, and then you have an interior that was done by a wonderful dressmaker, Charles James.
Right. And maybe the best dressmaker ever.
Yeah. And just incredible taste and refinement, which obviously both of the inhabitants had, and in particular Margaret and Wittgenstein had. But I thought that would be actually quite an interesting.
It's worth saying that one of the striking things
is, in a way, in its own way, as interesting as Wittgenstein Loos would be Dominic de Menil and
I could get that. Well, the very interesting thing about this house is the extent to which the architectural frame and the interiors themselves were never fully integrated. Right, one existed and they existed apart from each other always. It allowed the frame allowed the interiors to be altered many times without problem, very much the way that works in the de Menil house. You could just simply have another designer go on there and make the interiors completely anew, and if it were a good designer, they would be fine, right? Yeah. Yes?
I just wanted to ask or remind Allan, there is a list that Wittgenstein made late in life, in the 30s in Cambridge, a list of the people who mostly influenced him in his life, and Loos is one of them, and I believe this is even after Loos' death. Loos died 36, I think it's a little bit later.
No, he died earlier.
No? So,
Earlier.
okay.
What did you want me to
No,
comment on?
because you said we know almost nothing
Yeah.
about them, but at least at the end it
Oh
was
yeah,
an
no,
influence.
I mean, there's a point is there's absolutely no problem about the fact that there is some kind of relationship. I mean, we can know that from 1914 where they meet and Wittgenstein says, "You are me," and why he said that we don't have the slightest idea. But I think what Christopher Long has been talking about gives me at least some glimmer of hope for understanding that statement, also for understanding why Wittgenstein drops Loos like a hot potato after the war when he meets him in 1919. The man's gone mad. He's talking about sins against the Holy Ghost. You know, that was something that was not part of Wittgenstein's binary system, and he didn't want to hear anything about it whatsoever. So I mean, sure, we know all sorts of bits and pieces, but we don't have any real kind of explanation of by the way, it's same thing is true of Karl Kraus. I mean, Wittgenstein mentions Kraus. By the way, he mentions Loos almost never. Later on, he mentions Kraus again and again in connection with himself. He sees himself through Kraus and through Krausian style, and he says, "Isn't this style disappointing in the end, like mine?" You know, and I wish I knew what he was referring to there. Because I mean, on most accounts, Kraus is a penultimate German stylist. Anyway, so please. Further questions?
Here's one. Sorry. When I think the binary system is quite true within. You said it's a cultural decision, but and that is also a quite astonishing comparison between Loos and Wittgenstein. Isn't it also an ethic decision? Because the ethic discussion is also a very binary system, and I think especially the early Wittgenstein with his ethic and aesthetic is one, and Loos as a cultural critic, who I think there is a very strong ethical component to his writing.
Yeah, absolutely. Did everyone hear that? A question about it's not a cultural question; it's an ethical question.
Also, not
also
either or, but being a cultural question.
And I anticipated this question. It would have come out even more if I'd been able to show you the later texts, unfortunately, that we had technologically cut off. So it's an absolutely keen and correct observation. And my response very simply to that would be that for Loos, and I think very much for Wittgenstein, at least when he was working on the house, not necessarily always, but when he was working on the house, the ethical was wrapped into the cultural. In other words, they were part of the same thing. That wasn't always true for Wittgenstein, certainly. It was always true for Loos. Loos always understood ethics within a broader reading of culture. Yeah, so it's not that it's either or, it's sort of both and, if you will. Yeah. Good. Any other questions? Then I want to thank you very, very much, and I'm sorry about the technological issues. That's life sometimes in the modern age. If you have any other comments, suggestions, or complaints, please come see me afterwards. I used to make this, thank you so much.